Hi, everyone, and welcome again to another episode of Gaudium at Spes 22.com Podbean podcast and YouTube video. I'm very pleased to announce, by the way, that our fundraiser is almost done, but not quite. We've reached our goal of $28,000, which really is just astounding and amazing. And I'm just overwhelmed by the generosity of everyone. But now, since we're building the Pustinia Hermitage, we are looking to pick up a few more dollars, but I can't thank everyone enough. But anyway, that is neither here nor there. I'd like to welcome to the show today, very, very excited, a man I've met before, but I'd never been on the show before, Matthew Becklo. Welcome to the show, Matthew.
Thank you, Larry. It's an honor to talk to you.
Yeah, Matthew is actually the publishing director for Bishop Robert Barron's Word on Fire. All right. Everybody's organization that they either love or they hate. It's like, I've never seen anything like it, Matthew. Never seen
Yes, yeah.
anything like it. It's like, oh my God, Word on Fire is the greatest thing ever. And then you go in there and of course, I'm in that camp. I'm like, oh my God, Bishop Barron's excellent. The Word on Fire is fantastic. And although, and I'm always rushing to your defense whenever you're criticized in public, but it just, to me, it's, and we'll get to your book in a second, which is why you're coming here. But I just have to say, Bishop Barron must be doing something right. Word on Fire must be something right because they get attacked from about every angle imaginable.
Yeah.
And so, number one, it means you're doing something of substance that it provokes that reaction. Number two, it means that what you're doing is successful, which provokes the reaction. And number three, it also means that you've avoided extremes, and
Yes.
and therefore the extremes hate you.
Yes. No, and I've been a fan of Word on Fire, for a long time, long before I became part of the ministry. And the amount that the ministry, Bishop Barron, all the other writers and thinkers that are part of the movement have shaped my faith is just incalculable.
Yeah.
And really bringing forward the truth and the beauty of Catholicism was what really hooked me early on. I was raised Catholic and sort of drifted away from the faith, a sort of period of exile in my late high school, college years. Sort of had a reversion experience, and then shortly after that, discovered Word on Fire on YouTube. So I'm living proof. Proof. I'm of the millennial generation. Discovered Bishop Barron on YouTube and was a fan for many years. Then eventually joined the ministry. And as you say, I mean, it's been strange over the years to watch these periods sort of come and go where, oh, now we're getting attacked from the hard right and now we're getting attacked from the hard left, and it kind of comes in waves. And as you say, we're getting hit by both sides. But I think the beauty of Word on Fire is just bringing forth the fullness of the Catholic faith and inviting people into it.
Yeah. The criticism that I find most hilarious. And by the way, thank you for that short autobiography. It's always great to hear conversion or reversion stories. But the criticism that really most strikes me is the one from the radical traditionalists that say if we all adopted Bishop Barron's approach to salvation, we would not have a motivation to evangelize.
Right.
And
Yeah.
and yet here is Bishop Barron running the largest evangelization online operation ongoing in the world. So it seems like the radical traditionalists are not afraid that Bishop Barron's approach will be unsuccessful. They're afraid that it will be successful
Right.
and
Yeah.
is
And
successful. Just that argument just falls on its own sword.
yeah, it's manifestly absurd, and I've never
Yeah.
understood it.
He's
The idea
sympathetic
that
to Balthazar, therefore, yeah.
therefore you're going to throw your hands up and say, well, we're all just going to heaven. Well,
Yeah,
clearly that's not the case. We're out there evangelizing the culture. That's what Word on Fire does.
that's
So
right.
yeah, I'm a big fan of Baltazar. Love his work, and I agree with that position. I kind of tend in that direction as well. So
Okay. Well, that all leads into the topic of the day, which is because what we're kind of describing here is the fact that the church is deeply polarized right
that's
now
right.
between
Yeah.
a set of competing binaries. You've got like the radical progressives on one side, let's have women priests, let's have gay marriage, let's chuck away the entirety of the Catholic sexual, moral, theological teaching, let's revamp it all from the ground up, let's have a more congregationalist model of the church. You get that binary, and then the other binary. Let's just go back to Trent and its anathemas. Let's go back to the days where we thought most people were going to hell unless you were a baptized Catholic. Let's just roll that clock back to Latin masses and indulgences and all that, So, obviously those are caricatures, but that's the point, is that these polarizations lead to caricatures. And so you've written this book, which is what we're talking about today, The Way of Heaven and Earth, from Either Or to the Catholic Both And. All right, so I'm going to hold it up for those who are watching. Great book by Matthew Becklo. It's out by Word on Fire Press, The Way of Heaven and Earth. And the main point of this text is precisely that all of these polarizations and divisions that we see in the church and in society at large revolve around either or thinking rather than a typically Catholic both and thinking. Ultimately, there are problems, as you say, of heaven and earth, and a misunderstanding of the relationship of nature and grace, heaven and earth. Therefore, a misunderstanding of who Christ is. And then, therefore, your third point, a misunderstanding of what the church is, and
Mm-hmm.
so on. So that's my real quick introduction to what this book is about. But rather than me provide the lead in to the book, I'll turn it over to you now to give us a sort of brief description of your project, what motivated you to do it, and so on.
Yeah, it's a very good question. I mentioned in college I drifted away from the faith. I wouldn't have called myself an atheist, even an agnostic, just spiritual but not religious, I think is sort of how I
Yeah.
would identify, which is a convenient term because then you get sort of all the cred of being interested in things of God and spirituality, but none of the commitment, none of the binding power of religion. So that's sort of the state I was in. I was very interested in philosophy, existentialism in particular. But then, as the years went on, I started studying Descartes, who, if you know people like Jacques Maritain, Gilles Son, Descartes
Yeah.
is sort of well, let's just say he's seen as one of the pivotal figures where things went wrong in
I
modern
think that's very
philosophy.
true of Maritain, certainly of Gilson.
Yes.
But man, I remember really reading Maritain going after Descartes. But anyway,
Yeah.
go ahead. Go
Yeah,
ahead. I
this
interrupted.
one book he wrote, The Dream of Descartes, is very good. Three Reformers I haven't read yet. I think Descartes is one in that as
This
well.
one.
But um yeah, so Descartes, the if you know Descartes, sort of the skeptical reduction, this question of proving the cogito is sort of the ground of all knowledge. I was reading about these things, struggling with the question of idealism and realism. If I can just put in a little plug for Gilles Son's Unity of Philosophical Experience was a book that
Great
later on,
book. Great
yeah,
book. And I love Gilson. Oh,
yeah,
yeah. That's my version of Thomism right there. Gilsonian Thomism.
yes, I agree. So that book later, it would take years for me to read that book where I thought, wow, this is what I was wrestling with and looking for. But at the time, I didn't really have that sturdy perspective. I was just sort of wallowing as a newcomer into the great philosophical problems. So, as I said, idealism, realism, the question of are we a spirit? Are we just mere bodies? Those were kind of the issues I was wrestling with. After my reversion, Bishop Barron was really the one who introduced me to the idea of the Catholic both and that typically when we hear either or both and it's usually about Protestantism versus Catholicism, and there is a deep history in that regard regarding some of these discussions. But for me, the issue has always been broader. It's always involved the history of thought, the history of philosophy, just the reality of living as a human being. So the both and I just fell in love with it right from the get go. It's something that for about 10 years now I've been thinking I would love to do a book that draws together all these both ands and sort of lines them up in a row. Uh, not trying to create a system or anything like that, but just kind of showing a framework, a pattern for people to think about. Well, what is the both and? How do we apply it? What does it mean? So it's sort of my little tentative approach to doing that and drawing people into the Catholic both and.
Yeah, what I really like is how you set it up in here. Okay, so those of you who are watching, you can see me looking down now, right? You've got part one, which is really what you call the dilemmas of life, where you deal with all of the either or dilemmas that life in general sort of presents to us. And then there's the various impasses, the various either ors in part two that you called the dilemmas of philosophy. So these philosophical sort of conundrums, and then part three, the dilemmas of Christianity, like the eschatological, the already, the not yet, and all these kinds of things. And so let's kind of by the way, I highly recommend to everybody listening to buy this book because it's very readable. It's extremely accessible, I think, to even average readers of theological ideas. Matthew's done a really good job of
Oh,
taking
thank you.
what you've done is you've taken great, big, gigantic ideas and you've actually turned them uh, into things that into ordinary language. You've got that gift that Chesterton had, that Lewis had, and so
Uh,
on, of taking big ideas. And I really think, oh my gosh, and I don't want to get off topic here. This is what Word on Fire does, and that's why I love Word on Fire because of 20 years of teaching undergraduates myself. You know, I found that I had a certain knack for taking the same thing, big ideas, and translating them into without watering them down. See, that's the key. Without dumbing them down, watering them down, translating it into an idiom that average people can understand. And so that's what your book does here, and that's why I really do recommend people get it. So let's start with the dilemmas of life: the heaven or earth, God or man, God's place or man's place, the spiritual, the physical, the spirit or the flesh. Why don't you unpack some of these ideas? What the either or is involved, and then the Catholic both and.
yeah. So as I was writing this book, it's strange because I just sort of blacked out. As I mentioned, over the course of a decade, I've been thinking about it, working on it, putting down quotes, trying. My wife and I laugh because we look back at these. I look like I was insane, honestly. These little diagrams of trying to put these things together and what's the best way to present it, sort of like that movie A Beautiful Mind, all the
Oh
crazy
yeah.
drawing and that sort of thing. So I was just trying to get what was the framework to present these things. And what I landed on was heaven and earth. And at some point it clicked. I don't remember when, but heaven and earth, of course, in the opening of Genesis, God creates the heavens and the earth. And there's a wonderful passage in Augustine's Confessions where he's breaking down, well, what does heaven and earth mean? The different possibilities of that phrase. Of course, I think we tend to think the heavens and the earth in terms of the natural world of the cosmos. So it's kind of this linchpin image that runs throughout the scriptures. But then, of course, you see heaven, for example, in the Gospel of Matthew, coming to be used as another word for God, the kingdom of heaven, the kingdom of God. And you also have, this close association between spiritual realities, the angels of heaven, and also, of course, the spiritual and the physical meeting in the human person as sort of a microcosm of the cosmos. So those are sort of the four master categories that I realized all of these dilemmas that I'm wrestling with in philosophy, theology, culture, politics, they all tend to go back into one of those or a combination of those four categories. So that would be God or man, God's place or man's place, of course, sort of in quotation marks, what most of us mean by heaven and earth. And then looking at our place, the world, it's the spiritual and the physical. And then in the human person, the spirit or the flesh. Um, and then in that main section, we can dive into particular chapters if you want, but I was basically presenting Gnosticism as the ultimate vertical heavenward is the word that I use, the ultimate heavenward perspective. And in the early church, as we know, the ultimate challenger to Christianity. And then on the other side, the ultimate earthward perspective today is what I present as secular humanism. So that's taking man's place, the physical, the flesh, the body, all at the expense of their heavenly counterparts. So it's presenting Gnosticism, secular humanism, and sort of
Yes.
its different manifestations. And then how does the Catholic Church bring these together?
Yeah, it's really, I mean, the Gnostic heresy, right? There's a certain logical consistency to it because it has no use for matter or the physical, which it views as inimical to the spiritual. The fact that our souls are in a material world must be interpreted as a kind of fall, a declension.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, the spirituality associated with that is going to be escapist.
Right.
Ascetical, escapist, these kinds of things, Manichaean, and so on. And then the flip side, though, is a kind of radical monistic reinterpretation of spirit and matter that essentially everything is spirit in different modalities. And,
Yes.
matter doesn't really exist. It's Maya, it's illusion.
Hmm.
And our false consciousness is in the realm of dualism, Advaita, so you need. What is it, moksha, to sort of liberate yourself from this illusion, not from matter, but from this illusion. So, as you point out, I mean, only Christianity comes along and embraces the Judaic concept of
Hmm.
the creation of the material world as fundamentally good, and then presents us as these incarnated spirits, these enfleshed spirits, which is that then is the Catholic, both spirit and flesh. So maybe you could unpack that a little bit more.
Yeah, and as I mentioned, that was really the linchpin issue for me personally, and I try to bring that first part to a crescendo with the question of man. Your podcast title, Gaudium et Spes 22, is a
Yeah.
passage that means a lot to me, and it's in the light of Christ that we understand the human person. So yeah, all things, we can speculate about God and man, the universe. Is there a transcendent world? Is it just this world? But you can't avoid the reality of death, and that's sort of what I tried to bring to the fore in that chapter, is that ultimately we are finite creatures. We're thrown into this world, to borrow from Heidegger. We're wrestling with existence, and then eventually we will die. So that's staring you right in the face. Well, is death sort of the end? Are we just mere flesh? I borrow from Shakespeare a couple different lines that he beautifully says. Death is the end, and we rot, and we're food for worms. That's the end.
Yeah.
So it's a sort of nihilistic perspective that we're just flesh, and that's the end. Versus, as you say, this sort of escapism that this body that we possess, we're just going to fly away from, and sort of a Gnostic fantasy will ascend through the cosmic spheres and return to our spiritual homeland. Well, of course, the Catholic Church preaches the resurrection of the body, which I just think we don't talk about enough. I think there's this Platonic Gnostic shade of Christianity that just constantly presents itself, even now, 2,000 years later. And I think we constantly need to remind ourselves about the resurrection of the body, the new heavens and the new earth. Heaven and earth coming together is really the ultimate end of the story.
Yeah, I mean, we need to keep reminding ourselves of the struggles that St. Paul had, in preaching to the Greeks the resurrection of the body, which they found to be absolutely incomprehensible
Yeah.
given their essentially Platonic framework. What is it? Plato's divided line, the
Yep.
line between the material and the spirit. So Christianity preaches the resurrection of the body, but that kind of then leads us to another what do you call it? Another one of these impasses. We're going to anticipate a little bit the sort of more theological stuff, in your part three here, the three-part dilemmas, but the eschatological element, the
Mm.
not yet element. So I'll just pose this question to you. I mean, is there not the reason why I think the Platonic temptation is always there? Is there not a prima facie plausibility to the Platonic idea of an afterlife is purely spiritual in the Greek sense of spirit, given the fact that when our bodies die, they do rot and decay?
Hmm. Yeah. No, absolutely. And one of the books I read in the process of working on this book was Ratzinger's Eschatology. And that book shaped me in a lot of different ways as I was reading it. But this question of the intermediate state, I think, is something that is difficult. Needless to say, there's every one of these chapters in this book. There's been volumes and volumes written about, but I think wrestling with the subject of the intermediate state and the fact that it is intermediate, but we will die and our spirits ascend. Ultimately, we're looking at the resurrection of the body, but I don't know. There's this temptation to want to just sort of end the story there and to not bring it to. I think we see the fulfillment in the scriptures. You don't see as much the language of N.T. Wright is another person that Surprised by Hope, I think is the name of his book that I liked a lot. but he's emphasizing, of course, the heaven and earth coming together as the ultimate end to the story. But I 100% agree. I think that the temptation just sort of gnaws at us because of the reality of the intermediate state.
Yeah, and just remind those viewers who may not be aware of I mean, Aquinas talks about that. Ratzinger goes on at great length in his book on eschatology about what is exactly the intermediate state. Obviously, intermediate between our death and then the resurrection of bodies at the
Mm-hmm.
consummation of all things at the general end of time. But what is the intermediate state?
So the intermediate state is this dwelling with God spiritually. Ratzinger, I'm trying to remember exactly how he unpacks it in his book, but there is a temptation to want to discount it in one direction or the other. I think some theologians, you'll know more about this than I do, but speculate that when we die we pass directly into the resurrection. Aren't there
Yeah.
some people that have proposed
Yeah.
that?
Oh, yeah. As a lot of people have proposed, that we are equipped with a spiritual body immediately upon our death, and that is the resurrection.
Right.
And part of the proposal is that, of course, we don't want to be overly physicalist in our understanding of the resurrection of the dead,
Mm-hmm.
because they would view that as mythological. Oh, yeah, at the end of time, everybody's going to come out of their graves, and God's going to knit us back together into physical bodies. Especially in the light, I think a lot of these ideas are motivated by the fact, the realization that when we die and our bodies dissolve, the atoms that are in our body get
Right.
sucked up by the soil and the trees and the air and end up in
Yes, yes.
somebody else, perhaps even eventually, which I don't have a problem with because it could actually then really just reinforce the corporate nature of salvation, where, part of this physical stuff that I am might end up in somebody down the road,
Yeah, yeah.
stardust or whatever. So I think this kind of was there's a residual sort of Hellenizing, Platonizing sort of distrust of the idea as mythological that our bodies are
Right,
going to be resurrected. And so, yeah, they say, okay, so an intermediate state where we're just like Tinkerbell floating around on a cloud
right,
waiting to be reunited with our bodies, they think is an unnecessary idea. So
right. And
that's
of course,
that's the gist of it.
purgatory as well. Purgatory ties into this whole conversation as well. And there's, of course, a lot of resistance to that. Luther, if I understand right, he proposed the soul sleep idea,
Yeah.
um, which you also find on the other side, that there's no real intermediate state. It's more that when you die, you're drawn into this sort of sleep, and then you will resurrect on the last day.
Yeah.
So
You know,
there's temptations in both
there's
directions.
there was an Anglican thinker, Sir Malcolm Jeeves, who was a neuroscientist but also an Anglican believer, kind of like a John Polkinghorne type, who came and gave a talk at DeSales University once. And his idea, there's no intermediate state. When you die, you're dead. Your consciousness
Right.
goes away, but that God put you back together again at the end of time. And so he said, well, it's like going under general anesthesia.
Right.
You're awake
Yeah.
1 second, and then your next conscious memory. And so it seems you could be under anesthesia for 20 hours. And yet when you wake up, it seems
It's like
like
nothing. Yeah.
nothing, no time has gone by at all. And so his attitude is the universe might go on for another 10 billion years. And yet to you, you're from the point of death until resurrection, boom, it seems like, oh, I just died and now here I am again. But see, I think these are, I really, I think that was just a lame attempt on his part as a neuroscientist to be a materialistic reductionist, to say that mind is produced by brain, and still call himself a Christian. I don't think there's any way we can get around the fact, hylomorphic, that Catholicism teaches that we are composite beings of
Yes.
spirit and matter. And if this material, but here's the key, and I'm talking way too much here. People are always complaining I talk too much, but I'm just trying to set up the problematic here. If this physical body has no ultimate bearing on my resurrected body, then what is the importance of physicality in the first place?
Right. Yeah. No, and I think we always look back to Christ as the first fruits of the resurrection and what we can expect. And what does he do? I was just talking about this with my kids the other day. We watched an animated movie about Jesus, and they were asking, kids just asked most difficult, profound questions. But
Yeah.
we were talking about the resurrection of Christ, and what does he do? He says, "Touch my hands and my side and see that I'm not a ghost." And he eats fish in front of them. And
Yeah.
at the same time, there's something spiritual and mystical that he's passing through locked doors and all these different things. So there's a tension there in the scriptures. He's there, and yet in a way he's like in this transcendent state. He's not there in a way, and people don't recognize who he is. So I think we have to hold both sides of that together in terms of ourselves as we do with Christ in the scriptures.
I also think we have to keep in mind the empty tomb narratives. And it's actually what has led some very liberal theologians to deny the importance of the empty tomb narratives. I know that, for example, Edward Skillebix, in his book on Christology, says that the empty tomb narratives evolved very late in the early tradition of the Gospels. That the earliest versions of the Gospels hold no such empty tomb narratives.
Mm,
And that there, Skillebeck was obviously of the belief that Jesus' body is rotting, has rotted away somewhere. Uh, but I take the empty tomb narratives as historical claims by the New Testament. And so if there's no connection between this body and our resurrected bodies, why did Christ come out of the tomb?
right. No, that's a great point. 100% agree.
Yeah. Which is why those who want to deny the full eschatological significance of our bodies have no problem with denying that Christ actually came out of the tomb.
Right.
It's like,
Yeah,
oh,
they
those are just,
they all fit together.
yeah, it's just a mythological incrustation. Yeah, N.T. Wright is great on this. Once again, I'm talking too much, but no, you've unleashed the beast within me, Matthew.
No, please.
N.T. Wright points out something really interesting about that empty tomb late development narrative, which is this, that Judaism had a very concrete view of the resurrection of the body,
Right.
that these physical bodies are going to come out of the tomb. It's the Greeks that had a very sort of Platonic view of little
Mm,
souls floating around like Tinkerbell. So N.T. Wright asks, why is it in this sort of the empty tomb narratives evolved late theory? Why is it that when Christianity, therefore, is still in a Judaic phase, that they're all into Jesus as simply a disembodied spirit? And then when they move into the Gentile Greek world, they suddenly start talking about resurrected bodies and empty tombs. And this is absurd. It's absolutely absurd if we're supposed to be interpreting the gospel narratives as having been developed in response to the zeitgeist. All right. And so, yeah, to me, you have to read the gospel narratives as of a historical piece, and that they do claim that the physical body of Jesus came out of the tomb.
yeah. Yeah. 100%. And I don't know if you've read, I just stumbled on it recently, this essay by David Bentley Hart. Now, I should preface this by saying I'm way out of my league, even, trying to talk about his writing, but
Well, yeah,
he, I don't know. I'd heard this accusation that he denies the resurrection, and then I thought, well, that's weird. And then I started reading this essay, and he's talking about the spiritual body, and I forget where he wrote it. This long essay, but I think you can start to blur this line where you are denying the physicality of the resurrection. Of course, like you say, we don't want to fall into sort of a
yeah,
mythological physicalist perspective, but the fact that there is the earthly that's participating in the heavenly, I think you can't lose sight of that. The second that you start to do that,
that's right.
you go off the
That's the
rails.
key. The earth is the earthly. I like the way you put it. It's participating in the heavenly. Yeah, David Hart. David's a friend of mine, and I mean, not a close friend, but a friend. And it's hard to keep track of his evolving views on just about everything these days. But I think I know what article you're referencing, where several years ago, he wrote it now, where he started talking about how we don't really know what the Greeks meant by spirit and matter, and we've
Yes.
kind of
Yeah.
gotten it turned around sideways, and that they truly did believe that there was a material content to the spiritual that we have
Right.
not
Yeah.
taken sufficient. I don't remember all the contours of the argument, but that was the gist of it. But anyway, okay, so that I mean, this is just but one example,
Right.
one out of
Right.
many.
There's been
Uh,
tomes written about
yeah,
each of these
about
issues.
okay,
Yeah.
spirit and matter, soul and body, resurrection, and so on. These are all profound questions. And your point is that if you're going to be a Catholic, you have to maintain the both and. You can't fall either into a spiritual monism that dissolves matter, all right, or an escapist dualism that denies the goodness of matter.
Hmm.
Somehow or another, we have to affirm matter is good, matter is real, our bodies matter.
Yes.
Okay, so let's move on to the dilemmas of philosophy, and maybe I'll shut my pie hole and talk less. What are some of the fundamental either or dilemmas in philosophy?
Yeah, this was another. Each first chapter of the three parts sort of sets up the grand dilemma in my mind. So for the first part, the dilemmas of life, it's heaven and earth. The dilemmas of philosophy. Well, I should jump. Dilemmas of Christianity was, as you say, the not here and the not yet on the one hand, and then the here and now on the other hand. Philosophy was a tough one. The one and the many, is considered sort of the old dilemma of philosophy. You see the pre-Socratics, of course, wrestling with the nature of reality. Is there one principle? Of course, the early pre-Socratics were imagining something material as sort of the single principle that lies behind all
Fire,
reality.
water.
Fire, water, yeah, all these different things. And then I think it's Parmenides comes along and says it's the one, which is still, sort of a quasi-material reality, but there's this sort of stretching outward to something that some transcendent principle that undergirds the reality of the world as we all experience it, which is changing, growing, decaying, all these different things. Anyway, so the one and the many is could be seen as sort of the ultimate philosophical dilemma, but the one I landed on was essence and existence.
Yeah.
Again, Gilles Son was an influence for me on this, but I think you just see, especially with the emergence of Plato, who was it that said all of philosophy is just a series of footnotes to Plato? So we're all still wrestling with the
Yeah.
same questions that he raised. But I think you see this question of the forms and the essences, the transcendent realities that undergird, the concrete, tangible, material realities that we experience, which is existence. So I set up sort of Plato on the one hand as the quintessential essentialist, and then on the other hand, we have Heidegger is sort of the person that I landed on. Of course, he's sort of a proto existentialist. Jean-Paul Sartre is deeply influenced by him. So essence and existence. I mean, you just see this tug of war that runs throughout the whole of philosophy. Actually, the person I was thinking of was William Barrett. Wrote a book called Irrational Man,
Yeah.
which is very
Yeah.
good.
Great book.
And he sets up the history of philosophy as a pull between essence and existence. And by the way, puts forward Thomas Aquinas as sort of this very precarious, delicate balance of the two that happened in the medieval era. That was just very difficult to maintain. Of course, in the modern era, we've seen the pendulum swing more toward existentialism and existence at the expense of essence.
Oh, yeah. So once again, we've got this dilemma, either an essentializing of everything so that everything is static, and therefore change is either a corruption of that or an illusion. So once again, it's that same dilemma. And then on the other hand, opposite of essentialization is then the sort of Heraclitean, everything is constantly in flux and reinvention. And so you end up with, the modern absurd idea that we can even redefine our gender, that women can have penises and men can get pregnant. And, I can self-identify as a cat and sleep in a litter box. And, you know, and it's
Oy
all
vey.
good, you
Yeah.
know. Yeah,
Yeah.
I
No,
don't
I'm
mean to
glad you
drag
mentioned that
this down
though.
into the vulgar, but this is where you end up, right?
It ties to it, yeah, and that's one thing I wanted to, and I think beautifully I see you sort of going in and out of the different binaries, and I wanted my book to do that, was to show that these things connect. Toward the end of the philosophy section, I talk about order and openness.
Yes.
So order would be sort of the heavenly principle, and then openness would be sort of the earthly principle. The person of order, of course, they've done studies to find that conservative people who identify as conservatives tend to be more conscientious, more orderly, whereas people who self-identify as liberal tend to have a sort of openness tendency in terms of psychological
Yeah.
types. So well, why is the orderly personality the heavenly principle? I struggled with that, but I think it has something to do with the spiritual. So the orderly person is a person of discipline and structure and taking sort of the variegated reality that we experience and imposing from the top down some sense of order. Whereas the person who's open is much more likely to, be open to change and different experiences and things like this. So you see those principles, I think, playing out in sort of the pet projects of people who identify as conservative and liberal. What I bring forward as the Catholic both and is Catholic social teaching, which I think you see beautifully
Yeah.
harmonizing order and openness, holding them both together without sacrificing one to the other.
Because ultimately, the grounding principle is Christ, right?
Yes.
You know, the incarnation is what justifies all of this both and thinking ultimately, right?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And I started with God and man and the incarnation. So that's sort of the
Yeah.
point of departure for me. But in part one, I wanted to show the incarnation as, moving forward through the whole of Christ's life and through his death and resurrection and ascension into heaven. So I think the incarnation is sort of my starting point. It's sort of the orienting principle, but ultimately I would say that's just Christological, looking at Christ
Yes.
in total as the orienting principle for how we think, how we approach different issues. That's not to say that you can't say it's incarnational, or some people, say sacramental as sort of the leading principle. But I just think put
Yeah.
Christ in the center, look at the totality of who Christ is.
We are called Christians after
Yes,
all.
after all, yes.
It never ceases, and I try to, in all that I write, try to bring people. I just wrote a little piece today for the National Catholic Register on the death of John Paul. That what characterized his theology was this radically Christocentric theological anthropology. And really, what strikes me is how often Catholics forget that Christ is the center of, which should be the centering principle of everything.
Yes. Yeah. 100%. And I just had an interesting conversation last night with the Cordial Catholic. He's another podcaster, and a
Oh,
lot
I
of
know.
his,
Yeah, yeah. I've been on there, I think.
yeah.
Yeah,
And so a lot of his listeners, I think, are Catholic curious sort of Protestants who are exploring the faith. And, I very much had Protestants in mind as I was working on the book. Of course, atheists, agnostics as well in that first part. But I think the first two parts of the book, if you're a Christocentric, evangelical Protestant, I think you'd find very little to disagree with. I do put forward the Eucharist in the first part. So I think if you don't believe in the real presence or have any sort of Eucharistic understanding of the faith, I think you might tap out at that point. But I think a lot of Christians who, rail against Catholics for talking about Mary too much, talking about the saints too much, talking about the Pope and all these different things. Of course, I'm anticipating the last chapter on the Reformation. Would find a lot in the book to agree with and to be passionate about, because I'm
yeah.
trying to put Christ in the center of everything that it means to be a Catholic, in terms of how we think and how we live.
And that is exactly why I love the book, because now that's singing my song. But let's get back then to the dilemmas of philosophy. You do
Sure.
I think one of the things, I mean, you talked about your last section there, which was, order or openness based on society, Catholic social teaching. But before that, which I think is a key thing, you discuss the fact one of the great dilemmas of our time, one of the great fault lines of our time, is the Enlightenment's distinction between fact and value.
Mm,
The fact value distinction. Why
yes.
is that so important, Matthew?
Oh boy. Yeah. And the two figures I bring forward in the fact value tug of war are Kant, who, of course, if you study Kantian ethics, deontology is the name of the tradition that emerges out of him, putting value sort of in the center of our ethical picture, I think at the expense of circumstantial considerations of, that there's the famous dilemma that Kant dealt with about the murderer that appears on your doorstep, and are you going to lie to him or not? It's an interesting philosophical problem, but of course Kant says you absolutely can't lie as a matter of duty. You don't know that in telling your lie, again, the murderer is chasing after your friend who's sort of hiding in the back of the house. If you lie to the murderer, well, maybe your friend goes to escape the house, and then the murderer confronts your friend and ends up killing him anyway. So not only have you lied, now you've set your friend up to be found by the murderer. Anyways, this little philosophical conundrum about, well, when is lying permissible or is it never
Yeah.
permissible?
Yeah.
Um, of course, on the other hand, you have the cutting away of objective value and knowing our, dictatorship of relativism that we live in. That is what we wrestle with today. I think the pendulum has swung toward no recognition of objective values, and we're just, you see this in the continental tradition, the postmodern tradition emerging very strongly. Everything is just a struggle of wills, one person's willpower of another, different institutions and movements vying against each other. There's no real objective truth. There's no objective values.
Yeah.
The splendor of truth. Another important text by John Paul II on this matter. So there's the Kantian. There's I put forward Nietzsche as the sort of prototypical person of just mere facts. Famously says there are no I can't remember the line, but anyway, there's no value whatsoever. There's just mere facts, and these two schools of thought are sort of contending. Well, what I put forward as the both and, I'm looking at Augustine and Aquinas throughout that philosophical section. They bring forward the path of virtue, of course, rooted in Aristotle and Plato, bringing together the objective value that we're all striving for, but also circumstantial realities that we need to deal with as well.
Absolutely. That's well, okay. That's a good summary. Let's move on then to the dilemmas that the church proposed, the problem of the church, if you will, the dilemmas of Christianity. We've already talked about one, the eschatological, the already, but the not yet. Uh, but what about nature and grace? Uh, what's well, you have on here faith or reason. I remember reading that and thinking, okay, that's an important one too. But why don't you just introduce us then to this section about the dilemmas of Christianity?
Yeah. So again, the orienting polarity of this section would be the not here and not yet and the here and now. I think you see that
Yeah,
permeating the different dilemmas that Christians deal with. Again, people who all identify as Christian would believe, presumably, in certain baseline truths of the Christian faith that we receive through the scriptures. Catholics and Protestants will agree on these things, but how do you interpret these things? What does it mean to say that the word became flesh, which is in St. John? But you see the early church wrestling with, well, is does that mean he took on a human body? Does he take on a full human nature? Does he have a full human will? All these struggles in the first several centuries of the church. My proposition is that a heresy, which comes from the Greek for choice, is taking one side or the other at the expense of the other side. So the church condemns certain heresies that go outside of the way of heaven and earth. They're choosing one side at the expense of the other. Um, Faith or reason is, really was a really fun one for me to write. I'm looking at Kierkegaard, who's sort of this. He talks about the knight of faith. Of course, if you've read Fear and Trembling, he puts forward Abraham, the famous scene on Mount Moriah where he's going to sacrifice Isaac.
yeah,
Um, Really interesting book. And then, of course, Kierkegaard is wrestling against Hegel, uh, who's sort of the ultimate modern systematizing philosopher of the Christian tradition. Both of them, interestingly, were Lutheran, but you see them dividing very sharply on this question of faith and reason. Um, so that's one. And then you mentioned grace or nature. Great. That chapter is where I introduced the Jansenist movement, which I
oh
have
yes,
a few different chapters on, and read a lot about them as I was working on the book, and they're just very, very interesting to me. Of course, that term gets thrown around very loosely, as a lot of heretical names do, where I don't think it really applies. But I think if you study the Jansenist heresy, which, if your listeners know, is sort of quasi Calvinistic movement that began in 17th century France, very deeply Augustinian, but I would argue distorting the Catholic balance that you see in Augustine. Jansenists on the one hand, putting forward grace at the expense of nature, but then of course on the other hand you have the Pelagian heresy, which is saying that grace is there but only as sort of an assist. It's not really a determining factor in our salvation.
Yeah. The Jansenism thing is endlessly fascinating to me. We always tend to read it through the lens of caricatures, we're all familiar with the Irish version of Jansenism
Right.
as Americans, and its obsession over sexual purity and sexual sins and all this. But at the end of the day, and I think, your book is good at sort of unpacking these. At the end of the day, you do have to come up with some kind of a distinction between what is Jansenism versus what's simply a very, very serious attempt
Yes.
at living the faith rigorously.
Yes. Yeah,
I
exactly.
mean, I've been accused of being a Jansenist because I wholeheartedly ascribe to Dorothy Day and the universal cult to holiness, and that we're all supposed to live the Sermon on the Mount. And I'm a big fan of intentional Catholic living, that a Catholic should actually live like a Catholic. I'm very
Yeah.
critical of lukewarm Laodicean Catholicism. And then people say, "Oh, well, you're a Jansenist."
Yeah, and if anyone should read this section and think, well, I'm coming down too hard on sort of a Jansenist perspective, I think bear in mind that every polarity that I present is following this heaven, earth. And as I say in the introduction, heaven, the heavenly principle has to be primary. It has to take the primacy. And where I fall down is grace. I think the Jansenists go too far, but to their credit, they put grace in its proper primary place. I think they just overlook the importance of nature. Same thing with the morality chapter. Rigor, which of course we get rigorism, is what Jansenists are known for, versus laxity and relaxation on the other side. I think if you read Pascal's provincial letters, what a fun read. And I think he's rightly skewering some of the laxism that you see emerging in France
Well,
at the
yeah,
time.
Pascal was, kind of sympathetic with Port Royal and the Jansenists. He was, and I think for that reason, he looked around him and said, "Well, what's the alternative? All these stupid Jesuits running around with their lax." I mean, that was the reputation of the Jesuits, that they were the great casuists. They were the
Right.
great getting people off the moral hook sorts of.
Yes. Yeah. And I think there's dangers on both sides, but needless to say, I think the greater danger, looking at from within the perspective of faith would be on the earthly side, because you're losing sight of the heavenly principle that needs to come first. And how often in the scriptures are we told, be perfect as your heavenly father is perfect, stay sober and alert, your opponent the devil is prowling like a roaring lion.
Yeah.
I mean, you see it again and again and again. Be disciplined, be alert, be vigilant, work out your salvation with fear and trembling. It's just a constant refrain in the scriptures. I think we can't lose sight of that. We need to keep a certain moral rigor in its proper place as
We
Christians.
do. I mean, I remember when I taught at DeSales University. Of course, their namesake, they were run by the Oblates of St. Francis de Sales. And, Francis de Sales was famous for telling lay people that they too could be holy. And one of his main themes was, okay, you can find holiness in ordinary things, in
Right.
ordinary life. But too many of us now, these days, interpret that to mean its opposite. Not that we can be holy even in the midst of ordinariness, but that it is holy to be ordinary
Mm, yes.
in a,
Yeah.
in a kind of minimalist way. And that any attempt at rising above ordinariness is elitist,
Right.
spiritual Jansenist nonsense.
Well, as Bishop Barron says, the church has no interest in spiritual mediocrity. It's not here to just sort of make us barely passable, nice people. The church wants to make us saints. That's the whole purpose
Yeah,
of,
which is
yeah.
why your book is great, because it gives readers an ability to negotiate these things so that you begin to realize, no, I can oppose Jansenism because of its predestination ideas, its exaggerated sense of the corruption of human nature, and I can reject it for that. But then I can also reject moral laxity and the idea that it's nice to be nice to the nice, and the gospel reduces to suburban niceness. That there's something else that transcends those things in a higher synthesis.
Yeah, and again, Christ is always the guide for me as I go through the book. I think you see this tension playing out beautifully in Christ's ministry, to sinners. He, of course, the woman caught in adultery, he uh, drives everyone away and protects her. But how does he end that encounter? Go
Go and
and
sin.
sin no more.
Yeah.
So you see both principles at work, I think, in Christ's ministry.
Yeah. And I'm always, too, I mean, John Paul II mentions this. I think it's in Veritatis Splendor, but maybe, yeah, I think it's where, the story of the rich young man, the rich young ruler, depending on the translation, says, "What must I do to be perfect?" Jesus, well, essentially, okay, you've lived the commandments, okay, but now sell everything, give it to the poor, and follow me. And the dude can't do it, and so he walks away. Notice the Gospels don't say Jesus doesn't immediately start screaming at the guy, "Wait, wait, wait, come back, come back, come back! You misunderstood me. That was really just me being a bit hyperbolic and cheeky." No, he
Right.
let the guy walk away, and then turns around and tells everybody, "See that? That's why it's almost impossible for a rich man to go to heaven." It's like,
Yeah.
wow, that's not exactly accompaniment in a lax direction.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And I there again, I as we emphasize these things, you can't lose sight of the fact that Christ is gathering in sinners, he's welcoming them, he's bringing mercy. But to say that you're going to have that gathering accompanying movement without the call to sanctification, the call to conversion, well, that's a false mercy. That's not the mercy that Christ comes to bring us. He comes to bring renewal. He comes to transform our minds. And if you're gonna have the ingathering without the conversion, I think you're off the rails at that point.
Yeah, because then you're not transforming, then you're not redeeming. You're simply, I don't know what you're doing, but you're not transforming. I'm reminded of an essay by C.S. Lewis in a little book called The Weight of Glory. And the essay is called Transposition, and I think it's one of Lewis's most central ideas, where he points out that existence is like a series, Russian nesting dolls, where each lower order is actually embedded in the higher order, and once taken up into the higher order, becomes something more than itself, and also at the same time becomes its truest self. That sort of transposing of the lower into the higher is exactly what the gospel is asking us to do, right?
Mm. Yeah, and I actually have you ever read Truth is Symphonic, the Baltazar book?
Oh yes, Die Wahrheit ist symphonische.
Yeah, so I'm working my it's a short little book, but I'm a slow reader. I'm working my way through it. But he has this, of course, he's it's of interest to me because he's bringing together all these themes of, harmonizing opposites and gathering different principles in the church. But he has this beautiful little passage where he's talking about the church simultaneously, and this is what we're talking about with the rigor relaxation. The church is simultaneously ministering to people that are sort of on the outs and on the margins and in distress. But then in the center, it's this dramatic call to moral rigor and to transformation. So the church is not sacrificing either of those movements. It's holding them both together, depending on
Yeah.
where a person is when they encounter it.
Yeah. Oh gosh, I'm glad you brought that up, Matthew, because that's so much at the heart of so many, I think, of the debates in the contemporary church.
Yeah,
You know, are we to be if we're going to be a field hospital church that reaches out to the margins and the peripheries, we can't then at the same time be a church that emphasizes truth and doctrines because
right.
that's alienating. Or on the other flip side, oh, we're just a church of truth and doctrines, and you know, reaching out to peripheries is nice, but it's not central. These are both problematic approaches.
Yeah. Yeah, and I don't in the book I don't get into current debates in the church. My hope is that people as they read this will have alarm bells going off left and right and saying, "Oh, that's what this is about. This is what we're talking about." And these debates are just ongoing and the struggle is ongoing to try to strike that proper balance. But yeah,
Yeah.
100%. I think you see it right up to date to the present in contemporary debates both within the church and in the culture.
I find Pope Francis's analogy of the church as field hospital to be just a beautiful idea. I know
Yeah.
Bishop Barron's spoken on this on several times where he agrees. What a beautiful concept, church as field hospital. And I thank Pope Francis for coming up with that analogy. But I fear, though, that a lot of people that read Pope Francis's analogy of the church as field hospital see the church not so much as a field hospital as but as a hospice. You
Mm,
know, where
yes.
we take in the sinner and then we just hold their hand while the sin runs its course in their lives, but never call them up to, in a sense, repent and move on from those. A field hospital is, after all, a hospital. It's meant to heal.
Yes. Yeah, and I think that's what you see. Of course, Pascal, his satirizing is just brilliant and so funny. You feel like you're reading something from the 21st century, but that's what he's honing in on in these laxist, Jesuits that were ministering to people in a way that was just all about finding loopholes and making people feel comfortable and never challenging them, never bringing them to a higher place in the spiritual life, is a deadly path to go down. It's not what Christianity is about.
No, it's not. Rigorism, I mean, in a bad sense, and laxity. They both have, both rigorism and laxity, it seems to me, both have corresponding virtues. So, for
Yep.
example, a rigorist is somebody who simply takes too far the idea that we are to live the gospels with a deep existential seriousness. Someone with moral laxity has simply taken the notion of pastoral gradualism
Right.
and turned it
Exactly.
into, as what John Paul calls, the gradualism of the law. But there's absolutely nothing wrong with the fundamental insight that we have to softly, softly, gradually lead sinners to the truth. And there's nothing wrong with the idea that even in a rigorous regime, we have to be endlessly forgiving.
Yeah. No, and I think John Paul II is a wonderful prototype of that balance. Even in some of his teaching documents, you see him simultaneously saying we need to be present to people, to be patient, to be gentle with them, but without for a second, not for 1 second, compromising the truth that we're calling them toward. You need both. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's more art than science, and it
Yes.
requires a person of prayer actually to pull it off. One of the people I'm really smitten with of late as a writer is Bishop Eric Varden. Are you familiar with Bishop Varden's writings?
Yes. Yeah. I just read Chastity, which is a
Oh
wonderful
God.
book. Yeah.
Is it possible that, he could be made pope even if he's not a cardinal?
Yeah. He's
He's
he's doing a podcast, The Desert Fathers. I don't know if you saw that.
I have, yeah.
Desert Fathers in a Year as well. Yeah.
I've got three of his books. I've only read one, the Chastity, but in total, but I've got the other two others and I've read big chunks of them. My point is simply that, yeah, to go along with the both and theme of your book, Bishop Varden has got, John Paul
Yes.
had that gift. Bishop Varden has that gift.
100%.
That's my point.
Yeah. Highly recommend Chastity to your listeners. It's an excellent book.
Yeah, I mean, boy, that guy is just great. But anyway, okay, so we're coming up on about an hour of this podcast, so we should probably start to wrap things up a bit. Are there any other themes in your book, whatever, that I haven't provoked out of you yet that you want to cover?
I mean, I could just go on about all of them. I suppose, it's worth mentioning in the conclusion. You mentioned C.S. Lewis before. In his preface to The Great Divorce, he has this great passage where he says, the people that try to systematize all reality into both and are missing something, which is that reality does present us with an ultimate either or. For instance, good and evil are not both and in the Catholic Church. We're not
Right.
bringing together good and evil into a harmonious balance, and that's the point I try to draw out in the book, is that when you go to one extreme or the other, there is a connection between wholeness and holiness. So when you see this fragmentation, you're also seeing sinful tendencies just sort of running amok and let loose. So there is an either or in terms of good and evil, and there is an ultimate either or in terms of, are you with Christ or against him? And
Yes.
he says, I did not come to bring peace, I came to bring a sword. So, somewhat cheekily, I end the book on saying there is an either or in the midst of this both and in fact, I think the ultimate paradox of the faith is that it's both and either or. It's bringing together, as we read
Yes.
in Ephesians 1:10, Colossians 1:20, gathering heaven and earth, reconciling heaven and earth. But having gathered together all reality, we're faced with this choice. So we can't just sit back and say, well, that's it. You need to choose for Christ or you're choosing against him. So we're all in that position of having seen Christ gather every possible reality that we experience. We're left with a choice. We're left with an either or.
That's right. I'm so glad that you brought that up, because in the moral realm, virtue, yes, it's the golden mean, but when it comes to truth, you hear people say this, well, truth's in the middle. It's rarely in the middle.
Right. Yeah.
uh, if you're looking at two extremes and you're saying to yourself, no, no, truth isn't in the middle. Truth might be someplace completely different. It's in this Hoyeristic plane that can incorporate the extremes into itself, but in a higher synthesis that neither extreme understands. So, in other words, so we're not talking about yin and yang here. We're not
Right.
talking about the great woolly dance of the reconciliation of opposites.
Right. Yeah,
We're
no,
t-
that's a critically important point. And holding the two in constant tension is where we find ourselves
yeah,
on the way. And De Lubac has a great line. It might have been in Paradoxes, and I'm not even sure if I included it in that appendix at the end of the book. But he says that the unity that we're striving after can only be an aspiration. So it's not as if to say you can put everything in its place in sort of a Hegelian mode and say, well, now we have everything lined up and we've systematized everything, and or two opposites synthesize into a new thing, and there's this sublation that happens. No, we live in this place of just constant striving and
yeah,
tension,
yeah.
and it will be that way until the eschaton. That's the reality that we live in the church.
I like how you said it. We have a both and situation of the either or and the both and. Uh, because Balthasar wrote the moment of Christian witness in German, Cogita Ode der Ernstfall, and that's his point. We have to that in everyone's life you're going to be presented with this great Ernstfall moment, this crisis moment, where you need to choose either or
Yes.
Christ or the world or the devil or whatever. So yeah, so you're not arguing in this book at all for any kind of reconciliation of opposites. But you brought up all the quotes at the end. I'm glad you brought those up because I want to tell my readers, I mean listeners, I should say, it's worth the price of the whole book. All these quotes you have in the appendix. He's got this great appendix. Got all these fantastic quotes at the end of it from Pope Benedict, Robert Hugh Benson, Bernard of Clairvaux, Chesterton, Lewis,
On and on. Yeah.
Pascal, De Lubac, blah blah blah. It goes on and on and on. It's just I couldn't put. I just that was actually the first part of your book I read.
Oh, okay.
I was kind
Interesting.
of perusing. I said, look at all these great quotes, and I sat in like a half hour, read them all. I thought, holy cow. It's going to be for any author who wants to put an epigraphic quote at the top of chapters and stuff. I suspect your book is going to be a go-to source for a lot of those epigraphic quotes.
Well,
Well,
thank you very
Matthew,
much. Yeah.
thank you for coming on the show today. This has been delightful. I hope I haven't overspoke and talked over you too much.
No, it was wonderful.
And so I hope your book is very successful. It deserves to be successful. It's a great read. And so, to everyone listening, The Way of Heaven and Earth from Either Or to the Catholic Both And by Matthew Becklo of Word on Fire. So,
Thank you,
thanks for
Larry.
being on the show, Matthew.
Thank you so much. Been great to talk to you.
You too. And thanks for listening to everybody. Bye now.